We recently launched Liberation Martial Arts Online for trainers, collectives, and individuals that were looking for a program to follow that was chud-free, or perhaps one that came directly from us. Thanks to Shireen Asha Murugaya, Beekeeper Apprentice, and Sean Donahue for signing up. If you would like to sign up for Liberation Martial Arts Online, or you just want to increase your financial support of the Southpaw Project, you can find special tiers on our Patreon. If you'd like to listen to all of our shows without any breaks or interruptions, you can find uncut versions of our shows also on Patreon. This is Sam.
This is Jason.
And this is Fight Study.
Coach Jason and I are back with another edition of Fight Study. We're going to look at one of my new favorite fights of all time, Arman Tsarukyan versus Mateusz Gamrot. Then we're going to discuss the performance of Shavkat Rakhmonov over Neil Magny. Then we'll try to preview some fights from UFC 276. But to be honest, I was more hyped about the Tsarukyan-Gamrot fight than any fight on the upcoming pay-per-view. Now, since we had two incredible wrestling-intensive fights, we had to bring in our in-house wrestling correspondent, Coach Zach Goldrosen. Zach is notorious for hating the wrestling in every MMA fight, but the Tsarukyan-Gamrot card with the main and co-main actually impressed Coach Zach. That's how good it was. If you haven't watched those fights, go find it somewhere and watch it. So let's talk about the main event, Tsarukyan versus Gamrot, which was a close fight, with Gamrot taking the decision. I didn't agree, but I didn't hate the decision. But I want to get a consensus from both of you. Let's start with you, Zach. How did you feel about that decision?
I mean, it felt fair to me. I mean, I could see how someone could give it to Tsarukyan, but I mean, I think calling it, a robbery would be a little bit of a stretch.
And Jason?
I tend to agree with Zach. I mean, I gave the fight to Tsarukyan based on the spinning back fist knockdown in the fourth round, and after giving him the first two. I thought Gamrot looked fantastic, but I thought Tsarukyan did just a bit more damage, and the body kicks added up enough to where I'd feel comfortable giving Tsarukyan the nod. But I mean, it's one of those fights where both fighters, their stock rose, and like there were no losers here, especially from a fan's perspective.
Now, Zach, what did you think about the overall wrestling from both in this fight?
It was awesome. I keep a higher standard for wrestling in MMA than most because my standard is watching high-level wrestling. But this was so good that it made me break character.
Now, they were both obviously good, but it seemed like they had different strengths. Can you analyze their styles for us and whether cardio began to play a factor?
So Tsarukyan was definitely a little more aggressive early on. He had never been in a 5-rounder before this weekend, so maybe he was in sort of the spot that a lot of college freshman wrestlers end up in their first couple matches, because high school, the periods go 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. College, it goes 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. So a lot of times you'll see someone in their first college match, and that first period, adding on 1 extra minute, it sucks. So add on another 10 minutes. They're both good athletes who do simple things well at a fast pace, and that's pretty much always going to look good. The thing that stood out about Gamrot was that he kept the grappling sequences alive and his chances of winning those sequences alive just through good scrambling, just not giving up on the position, not bailing on the position or anything like that, because he's constantly looking and moving and looking for other options. Even if he's not in good position to start, he's usually able to find something that he can work to his benefit just by continuing to look. And that's something you build in the practice room just by putting yourself in those positions and working through them, and not even always at like 100% intensity either. Sort of like wrestling chess, so to speak. You just get comfortable in those positions. Tsarukyan, not that I would say he's a folk style guy. He's not from the US. He's probably never wrestled a folk style match in his life, but his wrestling, at least on the feet, looked a little more like conventional folk style. Where Gamrot was a little more of the scrambling stuff. And that's not to say that Gamrot's fundamentals aren't good. They're very good. And that's not to say that Tsarukyan can't scramble, because it takes two good scramblers to make those fun scrambles, even if one guy ends up winning those scrambles.
Now, Jason, in our preview, we talked about how Gamrot is more of the striker and Tsarukyan the wrestler. But it ended up Tsarukyan winning the exchanges and Gamrot having to adapt to more wrestling to win the fight. So it seemed like Tsarukyan came in with the right game plan, that he might need to outstrike Gamrot, which he did. What was so effective about Tsarukyan striking? Because up until now, he didn't even need it.
Well, he has great fundamental hand position. He keeps his hands up high. He doesn't telegraph his punches. He's got an excellent left hook, and he showed us a pretty educated jab, at least in the first two rounds. He moved away from it a little bit later, but there were excellent 1-1-2s to start off that first round, and he built off of those attacks with some great kicks to the body, always attacking Gamrot's strong side. So whatever open side, he'd power kick to the body, and he was able to land those quite effectively. So he was working with like a multi-pronged attack and mixing in his wrestling in the first two rounds quite effectively. Even if he wasn't getting the takedowns, he was still beating Gamrot to his hips a couple of times, scored the takedown in the first round. And he went in there with like the intention of using some of his very, very fundamentally solid striking to set up some of his wrestling.
Now, let's be honest. Neither gassed out. They were both so fucking good, but Tsarukyan did slow down just a tad, which in such a tightly contested fight makes the difference. So, Jason, with all those kicks and power double attempts, did you start to worry that Tsarukyan might tire a bit?
Yeah, for sure, especially in like the very, very first sequence, right? Do you remember that when the wrestling opens up with a brilliant shot block shot sequence that has Gamrot throwing a 2-3 combination, Tsarukyan ducking under with just a very well-timed double leg that looked like it beat Gamrot pretty cleanly to his hips. Then you see Gamrot show some stout defense and some really, really heavy hips and sort of stop Tsarukyan's shot right in his tracks. And then this is what's great about the whole sequence is it continues to build, and Gamrot hits his own like high C attempt and it's met with an excellent sprawl from Tsarukyan. And Tsarukyan tries for the front headlock. And just for that split second that he gets his elbow just a little bit too deep, Gamrot hits a real nice sucker drag immediately. No hesitation.
What's a sucker drag?
Sucker drag is where you pull that elbow, you kind of turn your head away, and then reach around to the far lat and take their momentum and run them through as a defensive counter to the front headlock position. And what was beautiful about that is that sucker drag, immediately after it, he hits it with no hesitation and then gets a big positional correction from Tsarukyan. Then Gamrot responds, and this is what I loved about all these sequences. Gamrot responds with his own lower leg attack and does a great job moving Tsarukyan around, keeping him off balance, and doing the good transitions, coming up the leg to the knee, elevating the knee, elevates the single. Then Tsarukyan just shows ridiculous balance and flexibility while he defends and fights the hands, and then both fighters separate. And that is the first 45 goddamn seconds of the fight. That's all that I described happened in the first 45 seconds. And so when you ask if I thought some of those power kicks, some of those heavy kicks to the body, and some of those, like, he likes to attack straight on with that double leg, especially baiting out like a reactive counter double. Yes, I was certain that that fatigue would have to set in at some point. And still, he still fought as fresh as any fighter that fights with that kind of style that I've ever seen. I mean, it was really, really impressive. And yes, he did slow, but he still was effective throughout against just a ridiculously game Gamrot, who came in with an excellent game plan and adapted incredibly well in the later half of the fight.
Now, before we started recording, you were saying something about how this fight to you represents what MMA should look like now, or what the future of MMA could be. Can you elaborate on that?
Not only was I saying that it is some of the best wrestling from an offensive, defensive, and counter offense perspective, But because wrestling is part of fighting, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, and both Gamrot and Tsarukyan have complementary striking skills and excellent cardio, I really believe it's how fighting is supposed to look when mixed martial arts is done correctly, when it is fucking done correctly, and not simply influenced by swanging and banging and just bleed entertainment pressure put on by Dana and the UFC brass. And I hope the MMA media and talking heads continue to give the fight the credit it deserves, because it was fucking brilliant. And I also hope some coaches open their eyes into understanding, like, wrestling doesn't have to be lay and pray if you work complementary skill sets. And you also teach people to transition effectively and not just try to blast through hips all the time, muscling body locks, muscling bad double leg entries, bad single legs, and a race to fucking nowhere. You know, if you have some sort of critical path that is building to something, if it's logical, and you can grow it and you can build it, and if you're a good enough coach and teacher, you should be at the UFC level. If you got UFC fighters under your belt or under your banner, then you should be able to teach it and replicate it. Unfortunately, I'm just not seeing that enough. But having seen it in this last fight, man, it really, really I couldn't be more pleased.
Yeah, I think we all were talking about how we've never seen an MMA fight like this or look like this before. It's almost like getting a glimpse into what MMA could look like 30 years from now.
Right. And isn't that what I always bitch about? Like, I get it. I'm a complainer and a bit of a hater, right? But that's what I complain about, is because they say wrestling is boring. It doesn't have to be. Like, wrestling is a part of fighting, and it's an essential part of fighting. And if you plan for it and you develop it and you develop it correctly and you have the cardio to support it, then, you know, it can be brilliant. And that brilliance was on display with Gamrot and Tsarukyan.
Now, Zach, what the hell was Gamrot doing in those scrambles? Because you could just not hold him down.
Just moving, looking for hip separation, looking for angles, looking for different grips. It's hip separation, the bottom fighter creating some space between their hips and the top fighter's hips. When the top fighter is able to kill that space in between hips, that's when they can create pressure. So that's why Gamrot was rolling, and it might have looked like he was kind of being a wild man going for broke, but there was a method to the madness. If you just keep on rolling, even if it's only a couple of millimeters here, a couple of millimeters there, if you keep rolling, it's going to add up. And then you're going to have the space, you're going to have more and more space to move.
Now, did you see Gamrot using a lot of leg passing?
The one skill set I like seeing in MMA compared to wrestling is those leg entanglements and those leg passing situations. Because when you take away pinning, you're a little more free to work from your back. You're a little more free to work different attacks when you can attack submissions. So there's just more opportunities to develop and fully flesh out that game.
Oh, so you're saying because in MMA there's no such thing as pinning, leg passing, and that hip separation is more important and it's more available.
Yeah.
In their wrestling, did it seem like one was exerting more energy than the other?
I don't know if necessarily more energy, but Tsarukyan was definitely a little more aggressive the first few rounds, where Gamrot was a little more conservative those few rounds. Again, this was Tsarukyan's first 5-round fight. It's been a while for Gamrot, but he has seen some 5-rounders. So he's seen those extra 10 minutes before.
In terms of energy spend, I mean, we saw some great chain wrestling just throughout the entire fight from both fighters. And that's what led to some of those scrambles. And and Zach is right to his point. That is fundamental to high level wrestling, and high level being college and beyond. And we need to see more of that in MMA. You heard Felder and the rest of the commentary team say neither fighter is settling for position. That it was true. They're not, but they weren't, because they know what the fuck to do in those positions. Whereas other fighters who don't take wrestling that seriously or will concede to go to their back in whether it's guard, rubber guard, or whatever they attempt to do, a lot of other fighters don't have the same wrestling chops. And Zach isn't wrong when he shits on some of the wrestling ability, wrestling prowess of some of these fighters who are in the top 10. Some of it is very formulaic and mediocre at best, and they're using their physicality and some of the other things to make up for what they lack in technique. But what we saw with the energy spend of Gamrot versus the energy spend of Tsarukyan is that the chain wrestling in a great whizzer from Gamrot and the sucker drag to the low leg attack that he showed multiple times, it was really great to see in a fight. And it was really good to see him hit like shit that if you make that angle, he was able to turn the corner and really force Tsarukyan to work extremely hard to improve his position. So it was being efficient and technical in certain situations. And it's hard when someone is on top of you, holding you down to try to stand up. Get up drills are very, very tiring. Escape drills are very tiring. And you have someone who is good at holding wrist control and creating heavy top pressure. So where Tsarukyan was sort of attacking through the hips initially, you were seeing some of the lower leg attacks from Gamrot, and even the ones where he was like hitting like double legs at the hips. Immediately, he'd windshield wiper his legs. He'd make that angle, and his transitions allowed him to finish in ways that were more energy efficient, a little less labor intensive. And I think that's why you started to see his wrestling look like it was in the rounds 3, 4, and 5. His wrestling looked to be that much better, that much ahead of Tsarukyan's.
Now, before this fight, Gamrot said that his 5-round experience will make a huge difference. And it seems like he's adding to what Zach had already said, which is that adding extra time isn't just about cardio or isn't even about pace. It changes the whole strategy you need to use. And it seemed like Gamrot, now in hindsight, was trying to say that I understand how I have to change my strategy for a 5-round fight, whereas I don't think Tsarukyan knows how to do that yet because he hasn't been in there, which now seems very prescient. It seems like Gamrot was right about that, even though I do think Tsarukyan should have taken the nod. But I think if Tsarukyan was more experienced with 5 rounds, it would have been that much more clear cut. But Jason, let me ask you this. What did either show you in this fight that you wish you saw more in MMA fights, especially at the high levels?
Well, a big thing is, this isn't necessarily what they showed individually, but what they showed collectively is that getting good wrestlers to look polished with their striking seems more readily accomplished than turning excellent strikers into polished wrestlers. Whether there's an aversion to it or some sort of like mental block in coaching or some sort of expertise bias, I don't fucking know. And I don't care. But this is an MMA dynamic that we're starting to see more of, that getting wrestlers to look polished with their striking is more easily accomplished than turning excellent strikers into polished wrestlers. That's what I'm starting to notice. And if you can get good wrestlers to understand the whens, the whys, and hows to do things with complementary skill sets, it actually makes some of the wrestling entries a little easier and a little less labor intensive. So, like, Zach, does anyone in the world want to wrestle for 15 fucking straight minutes?
Absolutely not.
Right? It's really fucking hard.
You know, a college match is 7 minutes, and those get exhausting.
Those 7 minutes are ridiculously hard. You wouldn't want to double that, then add one. So you're starting to see some of these guys, like, I'm tired of seeing really good wrestlers who come in from the college level, like beat the shit out of someone for the first 5 minutes, takedown, then get guillotined in 2.5 minutes into the second round, which is 7.5 minutes of wrestling. And at that point, you're completely spent. And then someone just grabs a shitty guillotine and you lose. Like, those days should be done. Understanding that, I think Arman and Gamrot made that very, very clear, that if you work some things sequentially and build striking setups because of your wrestling and wrestling setups because of your striking, you can be much more effective and fucking plenty efficient. And it doesn't have to be that hard. It doesn't have to be that much of an energy spend. And you can be incredibly dangerous with some solid striking fundamentals and excellent wrestling that really can carry you pretty far. Now, if you're just a wild man, just throwing caution to the wind and double leg, you're going to tire because you can. No one can push that kind of pace for 15, let alone 25 minutes in an MMA fight. You just can't.
Now, Zach, you mentioned things that you normally see in college to international wrestling at the high levels. But in this fight, what did either show you that you normally don't see in MMA or not see enough?
Keeping good body position as best they can. And when they did end up out of position, they were very quick to correct their position. They were transitioning quickly between their different moves and holds instead of, these little pauses that sometimes you see with a lesser wrestler or a lesser grappler. These are things I teach to 15-year-old high school kids. So I also expect adult professional athletes to be able to do these things.
Yeah, there it is.
So then, as a counterexample, what was lacking in Rodolfo Vieira's wrestling where he couldn't get any takedowns? Maybe he's more of an example of the type of wrestling in MMA that you hate.
Yes. One big thing is he shoots from too far away. So that alone kills the shot a lot because, all your opponent has to do if you're shooting from too far away is block with their hands, move their feet just a little bit. He did most of the defense for them by shooting from that far out. When he does get in, there is that little bit of a lag between his shot and his finish. And when his first attempt at the finish does get stopped, which is going to happen when you're fighting somebody who can defend, like Curtis, as much as I'm kind of going to be crapping on Vieira's wrestling right now, Curtis was defending well. And that's part of what was making Vieira look so bad in the wrestling.
What was he doing?
Again, fundamental things, using the wizard, using good first line defense with head and hands, and going to look a little bit different in wrestling, in MMA compared to wrestling, because wrestling, most shots are going to be coming from tie-ups and stances that you don't really see in MMA. So the theory is going to be the same, but the application is going to look a little different. But still that scenario of just good fundamental lines of defense. And when Vieira's first attempt on those finishes was getting stuffed, he didn't really have a second attempt. He was just failing to guard, and maybe that's fine in BJJ, but MMA is just too developed now at this point for that to be reliable at a high level.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Now, Vieira is one of the all-time best in no-gi grappling. Jason, why is that not carrying over to his MMA?
I think part of what Zach just alluded to is a point that I made in previous episodes, that there's this, I call it a hitch. Like, their entries are fine, but then there's a pause while they think about what they do. Now watch Gamrot. Like, Gamrot's hitting that sucker drag, and then whenever his opponent, whenever Arman corrects and like counter rotates, he understands that to counter rotate, you've got to put pressure off that near foot. Now the drag arm that's going around the back, he circles back down, bang, to a little no-nothing single leg, like ankle pickup. That hitch is everything. It gives another person, especially when there's a cage involved, you need to get clean with your finishes. And the only way you get clean is chaining things together sequentially without that hitch, a continuation of motion, continuing to make your opponent kind of correct position. And if you think you're going to get, that's the beauty of, and when Zach talks about like legit D1ers, It's their second, third, and fourth movement that is allowing them, unless it's Jordan Burroughs, which is blast through everybody, but it's the second, third, and fourth movement that is completing the takedown. So you see guys hit like that little, you see guys hit drags all the time, and when guys come up, they'll step up and follow up and hit a nice body lock off of it. Now, I'm not saying that is easy shit for some of these individuals to learn in a few years, because wrestling is very tactile and some people just don't take to it the same way. But to completely ignore it while others have it is going to be, I think, is a fool's errand. And I think they rather than saying wrestling is boring and no way to get a contract in the UFC, you're understanding that people are getting too good as professional athletes to be one and done with your initial takedown attempt, unless, like I said, unless you're Jordan Burroughs.
Now let's move on to the domination of Shavkat Rakhmonov over Neil Magny. The odds makers really nailed this fight. Jason, you said Rakhmonov is a problem at 170. What did he show you in this fight in what was on paper his toughest test?
He is incredibly confident. We talked about self-belief the other day. But this motherfucker has pistons for fists. Like, he just punches, and you see, I don't know what pounds of pressure per square inch. I don't know how his punches, when he hits the mat instead of his opponent, when he missed Magny's head, I figured he just fractured his hand. He hit so goddamn hard. And he has this like relaxed countenance and relaxed movement. And even his hands aren't in perfect position all the time. And when you try to engage him, it's almost immediate. Once he gets something to compute, it's kill switch engaged. And I think he's exceptionally strong and hits so very hard and throws straight punches and finds accuracy on those power shots that, it's a holy shit moment for guys, even guys as seasoned as Magny in there. When that shit starts happening to you, and that's the thing. Like, if you're in the UFC and you're Neil Magny, what do you win 9 fights straight one time, and he got wins over absolute legends? If you make someone look a little panicked, that has the ability to weather a storm and fight 15 to 25 minutes like Magny can. Magny doesn't get tired, but still he looked a little panicked early, and I think that tells you about the skill set that Rakhmonov is working with.
Now, Magny didn't do anything wrong in this fight, but it's like you can't get away with even feeler techniques against Rakhmonov. Everything has to be dialed in and have a reason behind it, because if you're just kicking to get a feel for range or just to get a reaction, well, we saw in both rounds, that's all it took for Rakhmonov to take over. Jason, how do you fight a guy like this where you can't really make any mistakes or even get sloppy?
Well, I'll tell a real quick story. I wrestled Curtis Jones in college, who was a 2-time national finalist. He was on my team at West Virginia University. And when I first put hands on him, if the score was 100-1, I'd be being generous. Like, I couldn't get him off me. He was just so far superior, so fast, so skilled, so agile. And at the end of I don't know what was like the worst 4-minute ass whipping I've ever taken before I conceded. He looked at me. I said, I'm all thumbs today. And he goes, "No, bud, it's not you. It's me. They don't know. They don't know, but they're gonna." And I was like, "What the fuck did you just do to me?" and he did the same thing to Sean Haig. He did the same thing to John Koss, who was an All-American. Sean Haig was the number 1 recruit. Sometimes you get a guy who just has like legit physical gifts. And I think Rakhmonov is one of those guys. Like, he hits hard. He's physically strong. And like, he's not like super shredded and super jacked. Doesn't have traps starting at his ears like a roided up Vitor Belfort. He's just built for fighting. One of those guys that's heavy handed. I don't know if his bones are lead or what the fuck's going on there. But when he punches people, you see them just sort of like shift and give ground immediately. Grizzled fighters who like pressure at high pace, like Magny. And I'm really, really interested to see how the top 3 and 4 and 5 guys in that division do against a fighter with those kind of physical attributes that just seemingly is built for fighting. And I'll say this, as much as I love Yuri Prohaska, as entertaining as he is, I think a more naturally gifted fighter is Rakhmonov. And I was real hesitant to give him the love at first. I told you brought him up to me, and I don't think I even responded to one text at one time. I'm like, and then I just kept watching him, and I was like, oh, I missed this one. I fucking certainly did. Sometimes it's not you, it's them, and I think that was the problem.
Zach, here we have another Central Asian wrestler. What are your thoughts about his wrestling?
He's another good athlete who does simple things well. Starting to see a pattern here. This is usually what the highest level looks like. Really good athletes doing simple things really, really well. I mean, Jordan Burroughs' big move is a double leg. That's the first takedown most people learn when they wrestle. He's just the very, very best at it. I really like the way he was working from top. He seems like he's got real good hips and real heavy hips. We were talking about hip separation earlier. He's real tight with his hips at all times, and he's really bearing down with those hips. The fight was at 170 pounds. With how heavy his hips were, he might have felt like 270 pounds to Magny from on the ground. We talked earlier about how there's no pinning in MMA. Well, in a sense, there is. It doesn't end the match. But if you're pinning down somebody's neck and shoulders to the ground, it's really hard to play guard without freeing your neck and shoulders first. A couple other things I like that I saw. He was hooking around to one leg up like around the knee. Looked kind of reminded me of like a Navy ride from folk style wrestling where he's hooked but not like so deep that his arm's in danger. So good way to control, transition to your next hold, your next position. At one point, it even looked like he had a near side cradle locked up. It was kind of hard to tell to see if he actually had his hands locked, but the position was pretty similar.
One thing that I noticed during the fight where Neil Magny was on his back and he was right by his corner, and Neil is looking at his corner, to Jason's point, kind of panicked. And his corner says, just get to any position. Just get to any defensive position that you can. Get to guard if you can. They didn't even have any concrete thing for him to do to get up. They were just basically telling to find anything. Just get anywhere but wherever you are right now. Because that's how bad Rakhmonov was controlling him.
Sometimes you're just overmatched. And Zach, I got a question for you. Have you ever been in the corner? You ever been coaching a wrestling match, and then they flip the coin and they say your decision, the other guy defers to your guy, and your guy looks at you and goes, "What do I want? Top, bottom, neutral?" And you're like, fuck, man. It really doesn't matter. Like we're outmatched here. We're outgunned. Like we pick bottom, we're gonna give up near fault points. If we pick neutral, we're gonna get taken down. I mean, we're if we pick top, he's gonna escape. Doesn't matter. Sometimes you're just outmatched, and when that happens, sometimes you got to say, hey buddy, do what you can. any position. Like, let's just find one. Let's just any position. I get it.
Yeah, sometimes me and the other coach with in the corner, we just look at each other and we kind of just shrug or say, it doesn't really matter what you pick. You're kind of screwed.
Yeah, man. At that point, you do you, man. I wish I could be more of a help at this point, but you just can't.
So we had some technical difficulties. Zach was disconnected. He's back. He might sound different. The reason why is because he had to get a different microphone. So that's why. Now, one thing the analysts didn't pick up on was Rakhmonov's cage wrestling. You clinch him and put him up against the fence, which is MMA 101, to score some points. But against Rakhmonov, he has a series of trips and takedowns from being pinned against the fence. Then on the ground, he won't let you use the cage to get up. There was one point where Neil had his feet against the cage while on his back to push off and scramble. But as soon as Magny's feet was getting in position to push, Rakhmonov calmly grabbed it and shoved it aside and then rode Magny into the next transition. It makes so much sense to do that, yet I've never seen anyone do that in MMA before. I texted you, Jason, saying how freaky calm Rakhmonov is, and it's that calmness that allows him to make clear-headed decisions and see everything. Now, Zach, one thing I talked to you about was Rakhmonov's head pressure on Magny, which eventually set up a guillotine choke, but he was doing that throughout the fight. In wrestling, what is the strategy behind constantly pushing and pulling down on the head and that head pressure?
If you're trying to snap your opponent's head into the mat, of course they're going to resist that. And so that constant strain on their neck and traps, even if they're real strong, if you make them carry your weight for long enough, it's going to wear on them. It might not be right away. It might take a while, but it's going to wear on them. And once your neck and your traps are exhausted, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're good. It doesn't matter if you're tough. If you've got nothing left in the tank, you've got no strength left. And you're kind of out of options. You're just exhausted. Maybe not like a cardio sense where you're breathing real heavy, but Magny's neck was probably pretty sore when he woke up in the morning.
And to Zach's point, that's a skill I don't see people do. People aren't as heavy on the head anymore since they've gotten away a little bit from the tie clinch, because there's some wrestling vulnerabilities there. But like hanging heavy on the head, wearing out the posterior chain, starting with the neck to the traps, to the erectus spinae, and the muscles in the lower back. Like when you can start to wear that shit out, you start to see everything fall apart. And that heavy on the head, that it starts with like the muscles in your fingers to your wrists to your forearms, and you get everything working in sync, and you make them carry your weight. You come heavy with that pressure. You have what we call in wrestling, heavy hands, right?
Yeah.
And then when they come with that counter, right? And they come with that counter pressure because no one wants their head pulled down. And when they bring that head up, bang, there's elbows there. Or there's rolling your head underneath their jaw and controlling that position because nobody wants to be like just handled physically. So they fight you. And, you use your tools, you use what you have, and you wear on them physically. And then if they do come with some counter pressure, well, that puts us in a position. And what do I say all the time? If behavior is predictable, it is controllable. And we want to do that. We want to predict where they're going to go. And if we can use our physical tools to get them there, do so. But I mean, so much of this sport is born of just piss and testosterone and not enough strategy. A lot of that fight mentality, ridiculous bravado bullshit, should be built into you want to control someone's head as they go, their body goes. You want to win that hand fight, that head position fight. If you make all those little battles about the greater battle, I don't know what you use as a tool for motivation, the machismo or whatever fucking box you want to tap into, then get them working to some sort of critical path to build off. And I just don't see enough of it. But to Zach's point, I guarantee you, there's a reason why with 4 or 5 seconds left, Magny was like, "Hey man, yeah, I'm good. I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm out."
Yeah, I didn't even think about what Zach was saying about how tired his neck must have already been before that choke even came. And prior to that, that constant head pressure was killing every Magny single leg attempt. Magny kept trying to get out by going to single, which is very common in MMA. And just that head pressure made him hesitate until Rakhmonov gave him some clearance, gave him the room to come into him. But that was just to come right into the choke.
Yeah, again, that posterior chain is so incredibly important. And once it starts to seize up, just because those muscles are so taxed, most fighters, most wrestlers, most grapplers are sitting ducks at that point. You're not seeing a whole lot of funk when the head and the neck and the traps and the back don't want to move anymore.
Zach, you mentioned how Rakhmonov's top wrestling impressed you. Were there any fundamental or sneaky techniques he was using that most fans might have missed?
Really like the way he was kind of, hooking one arm around one of Magny's legs, kind of putting the crook of his elbow around like knee level on the leg. In wrestling, there's something similar called a Navy ride. You'd be attacking the far leg and elevating that, forcing some back exposure and scoring points that way. He used it more from kind of side control, attacking it on the near leg, and it kind of seemed like Magny had a hard time recovering back to guard because his near leg was tied up. But at the same time, Rakhmonov didn't have his arms so deep that Magny could have tied that arm up with his legs.
Rakhmonov is not fast nor high volume, yet he's had 16 fights, 16 wins, 16 finishes, and only one of his fights went to the third round. Now, I think a part of this is his brutal ground and pound. That's not his main thing, and he doesn't spam punches, but he does something most other fighters can't do in the modern era, which is to stand over you while punching down at you, which then means at maximum force. And the reason people don't do this anymore is because when you try, people will sweep you, single leg you, or get back up. But so far, his opponents can't do that. At best, they recover guard, and even that takes a while. Jason, how is he doing this where he's standing over opponents like old school Tito Ortiz against people who didn't know how to wrestle or do BJJ and just hovering over them and just punching down at them while standing?
Well, see, that's a great question because, I mean, I'm not sure if his torso is longer than the normal person's torso because his arms seem semi-long, but not overly long. But yet he fights long from that top position. And that's why I really thought he might break his hand punching through the mat, because that strike zone, he is like, normally you're punching, like someone's head is about 7 or 8 inches in circumference, right? So you got to figure he's going to land about 4 inches short if he's punching through the center of a human being's skull. It's on the mat, but yet he's punching through that mat. Like he's getting extension and torque on that motherfucker. And you're like, whoa, what's this guy doing?
I guess if you're getting concussed, you can't really sweep.
You have to be present in that moment. What is the initial threat? Let's mitigate that initial threat. And, that's what you have to contend with first before you can build off of it. And I think that's what, when we sort of like in jazz talk about the corner advice of like, just get to any position, but like you have to get to something at least fundamental for us to work with you off of that. Until then, it's just like, sorry, man.
Give me something I can work with here.
Right?
I think part of it is also something Zach spoke to earlier about hip pressure, where once he's standing over you and you have your legs kind of draped over his thighs, he will immediately start driving his hip forward. You'll see that. And then he'll walk forward with his hips and then stand over you where your butt is off the ground. And then he'll just start hammering you. Zach, have you seen that type of hip pressure before? And what else is he doing from there that makes it so hard for him to get knocked off his feet?
I want to say it's almost like inverted leg riding, so to speak. Like he didn't have like a leg in, so to speak. He didn't have legs in at all, but he was kind of, the way he was, really leaning in heavy with those hips, keeping them tight. Similar concept. I think he actually walked his hips so far forward and stacked Magny so vertically onto his neck and shoulders that I mean it's very common to see fighters kind of be able to kick away, create some space, and stand back up from there. But if you're stacked as vertically as Magny was, that's a really hard thing to do.
If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
He was basically pancaked, it seemed like. And the analysts were talking about those up kicks, but they did land, but he was so pancaked and his hips were already off the ground and he was so stacked on his neck. Those up kicks didn't really have that much power because Magny didn't even have the ground contact to generate power, unlike Rakhmonov's punches from there.
Yeah, as a matter of physics, I think that Rakhmonov put himself in the more physically advantageous position. And whenever you got to deal with Magny's length, certainly, right? His legs, his arms, pretty lanky individual. But even when you would see Rakhmonov do a good job of popping his hips forward and Rakhmonov being very, very vertical until he decided to go. And when he went hard with his ground and pound. And he's, for someone who punches that fucking powerfully, he's very, very accurate. And even the one that he misses gives his opponent pause because he basically punched through the goddamn mat and made them like really take stock of like where their head was. So you stop up kicking and you immediately you address the primary threat, and that's the guy with the piston fists trying to flatten your fucking skull.
Now let's talk about next week's card, UFC 276. We have Israel Adesanya defending his middleweight title against Jared Cannonier. Cannonier is the underdog, and it's really more about what can he bring to this fight to dethrone Adesanya, because the assumption is Adesanya will win. So, Jason, what does Cannonier bring to this fight that's different from other Adesanya opponents?
I mean, they've all got a bit of power, but Cannonier has, I think when I talked about lead in their bones, he's one of those guys that he naturally can just fucking crack. He really can. But as much as I'd love to see, Izzy, who's now the company man, like take a beating from someone like QAnon Cannonier, or let them like beat the shit out of each other to a draw, so then either one could take home a win bonus. I don't think Cannonier is diverse enough of a threat, but I'll tell you what, he does hit very, very hard. But a lot of his punt, he's a pretty good kicker, but he doesn't do things with the same kind of technical proficiency that Izzy does. And I think you're going to see Cannonier get chewed up a little bit, not too differently than you saw Paulo Costa get roughed up by him, eating the leg kicks early. Izzy's got the goods. I mean, he can hit you with both hands. He can kick you. He can play. It doesn't matter. And you're just not gonna steamroll him with cage pressure either. He's too savvy at distance.
And he also has the chin too when he needs it.
He really does. He can take a punch. He can take a punch. And again, it goes, whether or not he has a cast iron jaw, he's also able to stay calm and composed when he's in the thick of it. And to be able to handle like that high intensity shit in real time and have that pocket presence, that changes the way. It's not if you get hit, it's how you get hit. And how he gets hit is just a little bit differently. Being in there with guys like Whitaker and Romero, and even though they only threw like 12 punches total in that fight, and we've seen the story of Izzy's career is he very rarely gets hit flush. He just doesn't. And he's so good with the counter that if you try to overcommit to the third and fourth shot, he clips you.
Zach, to beat Adesanya, you probably need some takedowns. Has Adesanya shown you anything where he might be open to a certain takedown?
So it seems like Adesanya gets up. Not that he gets taken down very much at all, because even though he's not a great wrestler per se, what he does well is manage distance in a way that makes it really hard to initiate wrestling sequences in the first place. I mean, if Yoel Romero, who is a world champion freestyle wrestler, isn't taking you down, it wasn't because he out wrestled Romero. Romero was unable to initiate, was not getting to those sequences, and risky to try to get to those sequences, get in that like that with Adesanya. But and even if you can, like, that's not to say he's incompetent there, but in close up against the cage is where he's least comfortable. I mean, he's getting taken down by Marvin Vettori, who, I mean, he's not terrible, but Vettori was a lot more aggressive than Romero. And that's why he was able to get some takedowns despite not being anywhere near the wrestler that Romero is. But again, that being that aggressive with Adesanya poses its risks, and scoring those takedowns still isn't going to guarantee you the decision. Gave up those takedowns and beat Vettori anyway.
Do you remember anything notable about Cannonier's wrestling? Does he have any offensive wrestling?
Not really. He barely even attempts takedowns. Like his wrestling, he does have some wrestling competence, but it's mostly in a defensive sense. He was defending takedowns against Derek Brunson, who was a Division II All-American. I mean, not Division I, but Division II All-Americans are really, really good. The Division II All-American just kicked my ass the other day. He did manage to take down Brunson in that fight-ending sequence, but Brunson was already hurt bad when the takedown happened. So I just don't see Cannonier suddenly becoming a wrestler now.
What Cannonier's 5'9"? I mean, I think they might lie and say he's 5'10" every once in a while. But Izzy's length and that wide cage stance, whenever he spreads his legs and digs his heels into like the area between the cage and the mat, he's real hard to take down against the cage. And guys burn a lot of energy, like racing to a fucking red light, thinking that they're going to, and they just push him against the cage. And whenever they separate, their arms are a little bit taxed. And I think that's what Izzy does incredibly well. When you try to force a wrestling sequence, and you wear yourself out and you try to take the 15, 20, 30 seconds to get some of that lactic acid out of your arms, get some of that blood that's pumped into your biceps, shoulders, and traps. He starts to put it on you when you want that gentleman's agreement for a little bit of a break in between those sequences, in between those exchanges. He doesn't give it to you. And that's what I think it's going to look like whenever they fight. There's going to be some smart pressure from Cannonier, but he's a heavily muscled individual. He's very, very, very strong. And he hits hard. And unless he catches Izzy flush or even just clips him in a vulnerable spot, then I see Izzy chewing him up.
Then we have the trilogy fight between featherweight champ Alexander Volkanovski versus former champ Max Holloway. Now, each of their fights have been close. I actually had Holloway winning the second fight. I'd say Holloway did more damage in their first fight, but lost on points. So even though Holloway has lost twice, this fight is still intriguing for those reasons, and because Max has beaten the hell out of everyone else. But so has Volkanovski. Now, since this is their third fight, we don't have to go too deep into this because a lot of this we've already said. But Jason, what does Holloway have to do this time to seal the victory where there's no doubts?
I don't know if it's possible against a fight that's so competitive and so closely contested. I mean, if I had an idea, I would give their camp a phone call and say, look, I used to call Coach Paul Felder. You should listen to me. I have nothing for you, man. And I've thought about it. The stuff that Max Holloway does well has worked against Volkanovski, but it's also left him a little bit vulnerable to some of the leg attacks and the leg kicks and some of the shifting pressure of Volkanovski. So you wouldn't ask either one of them to fight differently because both of them have had success against each other. In each fight, again, all the Max fans think Max won. All the Volkanovski fans thinks Volkanovski won. I go back and forth. I've watched the fights multiple times, and their skills are so comparable and they're so closely matched, so evenly matched that it's really, really hard to come up with something that isn't more of the same. The parry leg kick exchanges from Volkanovski really, really worked for him, but he also got picked apart with the jab every once in a while because he was a little bit too reliant on that parry. But those leg kicks probably won him the fight. So it was, I mean, what do you say? The same thing that made him vulnerable is the same thing that probably got him the decision, probably edged the decision in both fights. So, shit, man, I don't know. I've got nothing for you, man. It's what I do for a living.
What's interesting about Volkanovski is if you watch him fight, it looks like he's open to a knee or to an uppercut, but you think that, and then it's hard to catch him with those too.
No, because his reflexes are just stupid. They're so good. His reflexes, and it's hard to be reflexive when you are initiating a movement. That's why counter striking and counter fighting and counter wrestling is like it's, there's comfort there because it's a lot easier to be reactive. But he initiates and then can shift and respond reflexively as well as anyone in the midst of a powerful and dynamic movement. Volkanovski is, other than his parry and his lower leg kicks, is that shifting, hand fighting, jockeying for position, feints, and drawing out your counters, and then capitalizing on them. He's able to make those real time decisions because I think his synapses and his neuromuscular junctions and all that shit is just a little bit heightened.
So one thing I saw recently was Volkanovski sparring with Israel Adesanya leading up to both of their fights. And first of all, the fact that Volkanovski spars with Adesanya, that in itself tells you a lot because it's 145 and 185. It's not even like the next division up. And secondly, even though it's friendly sparring, probably not that friendly, probably more competitive, despite Volkanovski being that much shorter than Adesanya, and Adesanya has that reach advantage over people in his own division, Volkanovski was still getting in on Adesanya. And I was just like, Volkanovski can even get in on Adesanya during sparring? So that's a problem, right? But Jason, have either Holloway or Volkanovski shown you any improvements since their second fight?
They both continue to improve on what they're already spectacular at. And that's the thing. That's why there's no one in the division that I see at 145 pounds at this point that can hold a candle to them. No, they're head and shoulders above the rest of the competition. You saw what Max did, and Volk did to Ortega. And Ortega's a handful for anyone in that division. So to anyone that wants a title shot or a number one contender fight, I say be very, very careful what you wish for, because after you get in there with either fighter, they tend to change the trajectory of your career. And it's always for the worst. That's what you get when you get in there with Volkanovski or Max Holloway. They just seem to have fighting figured out, and all they do is fight the best in the world. That's what happens when you're champ, and at this point, we might as well call him fucking co-champ, right? Rather than number one contender. That's how good Max Holloway is. So when you're champ and co-champ, and all you're doing is fighting the number one guy, the number one up and comer, the number one guy in the rankings, you're battle tested over and over and over. And no one's been able to close that distance. No one's really even been able to make them look human. What I find strange is when I watch Poirier fight and I watch Max Holloway fight, in a million years I wouldn't put money on Poirier, but yet he really handled Holloway. So I guess in that sense, size does matter. But if I were a betting man and they were to fight again, Poirier and Holloway, I see Holloway taking it. He continues to improve and impress.
Here's what I'll add to that. Because what gives me pause is that they both did get better from their last fight, which is amazing because they were already so good. But where Volkanovski got better in MMA, right? He got better in a lot of ways, like his kicking, his shifting, his punching, his wrestling seems like they're better. He's like, his versatility got even better than before. Max got better, but in a very specialized way, which is his boxing has gotten better and better, which is why you pick him now over Dustin Poirier. But that's my concern, is the breadth in which Volkanovski has gotten better is much broader than the very specific way that Max got better.
Oh, I agree with that. And the ability for the speed, quickness, and reflexes of Alexander Volkanovski, at this point in his career, in his mid-30s or wherever he is amazing. Like, he's quicker and faster than he was 3 and 4 fights ago. Against KZ, he looked otherworldly. He looked so fast, so sharp, so well-timed. And when all those things are firing, camp management is something that I say is often overlooked. His camp seems to have him dialed in. He seems to understand his body, understands the weight cut. And he comes in there looking better and better and better against the creme de la creme of the top 145 pounders, which is one of the most competitive divisions in the entire UFC.
When he first came in, he was actually a lot bigger. Like when he fought Chad Mendes or his first fight against Max Holloway, he was a lot bigger. So he leaned down to get faster. So to your point about camp management, he's figured out, I'm even better in this shape.
Agree 100%. He's so good and so dialed in that I've had Jeff Lentz, Anthony Terrell, I got some other young kids that I've worked with 145 pounds, and if they offered me a title fight against Alexander Volkanovski for $250,000, For my fighter's safety, I'd say no. I'd fucking turn it down. I'd say, I appreciate the 10%, the 25 grand I could take to the bank, but not worth it. It's just not worth it. He's that good.
Now, Zach, wrestling has been a key part of Volkanovski's success, especially against Max Holloway. How would you describe Volkanovski as a wrestler?
Yet another good athlete who does simple things well and keeps good position. I think he might have wrestled a little Greco as a kid, and the way he wrestles in the clinch kind of does look like Greco. Again, even if he was never, super serious or super advanced about Greco, these are pretty basic things in Greco. Good control with the underhook, good control with the body lock. Even though there's trips from the body lock, there's no, tripping in Greco like Volkanovski trips against the cage with the body lock. But he is strong, but he's not just doing, the meathead middle school bear hug. He's pushing, pulling, feeling the weight shift between your feet, and then he's hitting the trip. Seems to have a real good feel for those shifts in weight, which I don't have that feel real well myself, but the fighters who do, those trips and those sweeps are going to be there. Even when he doesn't score the takedown, he's, again, working through these positions quickly. Wrestling up into an underhook or strikes off clinch breaks. He's pretty much always throwing strikes off every clinch break. It's not chain wrestling in the sense of, going from one shot to another shot. But conceptually, it's that same idea of chaining together techniques. My youth wrestling coach used to tell us the best time to score is right after you scored, whether that's hitting your stand-up escape right into a takedown, that little split second of, okay, time to separate. Those little split seconds where a lot of people kind of, mentally and physically pause. He's not pausing.
He never does. That's a great point.
That 1 second here, 2 seconds there where he's not pausing, that adds up over the course of a whole round, over the course of a whole fight.
And it's as disruptive as it is disheartening. You can't catch a rhythm because every time there is that break and you try to reset, he's back in your shit. Whether he's punching you or kicking you, it doesn't matter. Like, he's putting something in your face. And it's real, real tough. Like, you're not scared of that pressure. You just sort of wish it would go away for a minute just so you can, like, reassess shit. And you can't with him. And he takes that away. With all his other physical tools, that's a huge advantage.
And to Zach's point, looking it up, yeah, you're right. He did train Greco-Roman very early and won a national title twice at the age of 12. And then he went into rugby at age 14 and he focused mainly on that. But it seemed like he kept training in Greco as a hobby while he was doing rugby to stay in shape during the off season. And then through Greco is how he got introduced to MMA at age 22. So it was around age 22 where he started doing the wrestling MMA full time, no longer a hobby. So I guess he did have that wrestling background. It's a little bit unique for most people who are in MMA when they're a wrestler because it's something like they kept doing as their primary sport while they were going to school, where more like he was very high level when he was young and then he kept it up as a hobby sport while he had a different main sport. Though Greco is not the same as freestyle, not the same as folk. It seems like he relies a lot on leg attacks and going for double single legs now too. So how hard of a transition is that from going from Greco to doing more leg attacks in wrestling? Or is it more like just because they say somebody does Greco doesn't mean somebody only does Greco? Even when you're doing Greco, a lot of people still do freestyle.
So I think it's one thing that some coaches I've spoken to have told me, and I think I agree with them, is Greco, the positioning, it just teaches good habits. It makes you really aware of overextending your arm or bending over too much. And even though you're not shooting doubles in Greco, those are still good habits to have, even if you are shooting a double, because if you're bent over too much, you're too overextended in freestyle or folk style, you have a lot more options as far as what you can do about that. Greco, not so. And I myself am learning a lot, still learning a lot about Greco, but it's just a lot more dangerous to be in bad position in Greco because you can go freaking flying. So in the clinch, Volkanovski keeps his elbows in a lot, real tight until he sees something that he wants, and then maybe it's an underhook. Then he'll take his underhook. Not really trying to force anything or overextend himself, just good positioning. And then if good positioning is what's already ingrained in you, especially as good an athlete as Volkanovski is, it's going to be real easy to teach someone like that a double leg.
All right. That's it for this episode. If you like what we do, sign up for the Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program. If you want to train with us from wherever you are, you can also find that on our Patreon. You can find Southpaw merch at our store. You can find all pertinent links on the show notes. Thanks to Coach Zach for helping us on this episode. Did you want to tell people where they can find you online if they want to yell at you that you're being too hard on the wrestling of MMA fighters?
Tell them to leave Hamzat alone.
Yes, if you would like to join my Reply Guy Club, it's always growing. On Twitter, I am at GoldJaBoyTell'em. That's GoldJaBoyTellem.
All right, I'll put that in the show notes. With all that said, thanks for listening.
Always a pleasure, guys.
Yep, this is fun.